Hello, everyone. All right, well, welcome. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon for our country's leading ornithologist, David Allen Sibley. My name is Julia Ray Hoddenfield. I'm the manager of adult programming here at New Canaan Library. And I wanted to thank the New Canaan Land Trust and the Friends of the Bristow Park Bird Sanctuary for partnering with the library on this amazing and so exciting event. So thank you so much to them. I also wanted to take a moment before we continue with the fun stuff to remind you to please silence your cell phones. Take them out, verify. You don't want to be the person whose alarm clock goes off. In a moment, we'll have David Allen Sibley coming to present on what it's like to be a bird. And at the conclusion of his presentation, we will have enough time for a few questions. And so myself and another staff member will be in the audience roving around with a microphone. So we're happy to accommodate as many as we can in that time period. And at the close of the presentation, we will have some refreshments at the back of the room back there, and there will be some books for sale in the gallery space where you can get your books signed by David Sibley as well. And I want to thank Elm Street Books for being there to sell our books and, support local business there. While you're in the gallery, make sure to have a look at the beautiful auction items that are supporting the Land Trust and the Bristow Park Bird Sanctuary. And there's lots more to be said about the celebration that's happening this week. I'll let Chris handle that in just a moment. One more thing to be mindful of is that the library does close at 5 p.m. So if you're going to leave directly after the presentation, these doors right here on the left will take you right out to the parking lot. If you want to go downtown and continue to support local business, you can head out through the green. Okay? And now that I have taken care of, I think, almost all of the business, I want to introduce the man that gets everything done, it seems, in New Canaan. Board member of the New Canaan Land Trust, head of the Friends of Bristow Park Conservancy, and much more. Please join me in welcoming Chris Shipper as he introduces our speaker. Thank you so much.
Excuse me for one moment while I get into character. That was pretty easy. I'm sorry I left David at home, so I'm going to chat for a little while. The good news is that he's almost a man who doesn't really need an introduction, although I did prepare one. But I would like to share that not only is he a wonderful birder and a birding authority, but he's also officially a nutmegger. He spent from fourth grade through high school in Connecticut in New Haven. We all like to think that his birding imprinting happened here in the northeast quadrant of the United States. That's the background. Let me just quickly fill you in. David Allen Sibley is a renowned American ornithologist, author, and illustrator whose work has profoundly influenced the field of birdwatching. With a deep passion for avian life, David has become a leading voice in ornithology, known for his exceptional field guides that blend detailed illustrations with insightful and accessible information. His seminal work, The Sibley Guide to Birds, first published in 2000, is celebrated for its accuracy, comprehensiveness, and clarity, making it an indispensable resource for both amateur bird watchers and seasoned experts. David's meticulous observations and artistic talent have not only advanced bird identification, but have also inspired countless individuals to explore and appreciate the rich diversity of bird species. It's with great pleasure that the Friends of Bristow Park, the New Canaan Land Trust, the Conservation Commission, and the New Canaan Library welcome our most celebrated speaker in the hopes that what we can accomplish in 17 acres of a bird sanctuary or 400 acres of land trust property can be extended to all 14,400 acres of New Canaan. So without further ado, please welcome, a hearty welcome to David Allen Sibley, nutmegger.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to the Bristow Park Bird Sanctuary, the Land Trust, the library for making this possible. It's wonderful to be here back in Connecticut. I live in Massachusetts now, but I did grow up in Guilford, Connecticut. Got my birding teeth with the New Haven Bird Club in Lighthouse Point. Many of you are probably familiar with that. And it's been great just to meet some of the people here over the last couple of hours and hear all of the passion that there is for preserving natural spaces in New Canaan. So it's just wonderful to be here. Life in birding and bird illustration started very young. My father's an ornithologist, which certainly had something to do with my interest in birds. But I love drawing and I love birds from a very young age. I think my favorite subject first was dinosaurs, but now we know those are birds. Or birds are dinosaurs as well. So this is a drawing I did when I was about 8 years old. This is a photo of me at about 12 years old in Guilford, Connecticut, holding a what was at the time called a sharp-tailed sparrow, now a salt marsh sparrow. We did a lot of bird banding. My father was doing bird research of various kinds, and I just grew up with all things birds and ornithology, all kinds of opportunities that my father could provide. And my interest in drawing never wavered. For me, drawing is a way of understanding birds. There's a quote that I like from a book about drawing by Peter Steinhardt. He said, "A drawing is a picture of your understanding." That really rings true for me. It's the process of drawing, of taking a three-dimensional moving bird and turning it into a few lines on a sheet of paper. It requires a lot of practice, experimentation, and ultimately just a lot of understanding of what the bird's shape really is, what the key features are. And this is a drawing of the first white-winged crossbill that I ever saw, which was, as it says, in Madison, Connecticut, January 1974. It was visiting a bird feeder there, and we went over to see it. It has a crossed bill, and it has white in the wings, so obviously it's a white-winged crossbill. And I could have checked it off on my life list, but I wanted to do a drawing, and just this relatively simple outline sketch required 20 minutes of careful watching, and really I compare it to kind of an interview with the bird, where I'm asking questions and looking at the bird for the answers. So what's the shape of the head? What's the shape of the bill? How does the bill attach to the head? How long are the wings? What's the shape of all the white markings in the wings? How many white markings are there? All these questions go into even this simple sketch. It's why I always, and lots of people say something like this, I don't feel like I've really seen a bird until I've drawn it. Because just the process of drawing, just the act of going through these steps and asking the questions is my way of really getting to know a bird. So I got a lot out of the drawing, and it made me a better birder, better at bird identification, and I just kept at it. And also from a very young age, I had an interest in books. I enjoyed the challenge, the process of gathering information and compiling it, putting it together into a book. This is a book that I was working on in a limited print run of one, The Warblers of Connecticut. So I was using my father's typewriter and pasting in photographs that we had taken of birds we banded, doing drawings, and just gathering all this information. So I was probably 13 years old doing this, and it's easy to see but I enjoyed the whole challenge of gathering the information and putting it all together. And now this is a photograph of me as an adult, maybe a 20-year-old, drawing a hawk owl that I went up to Maine with some friends to see. And I'm going to take you through a series of sketches that I did of hawk owls. It's a species that I've only seen a few times, a rare northern owl. The sketches that I did of hawk owls kind of trace my history of drawing birds. So this is a hawk owl that was in upstate New York near my grandparents' house within a few weeks of that white-winged crossbill that I showed you a couple of minutes ago. So you can see the similarity in the style of sketching. And this was very quick drawings that I did as we were driving away or getting ready to drive away. This was a quick stop on a visit to my grandparents. One of the things I wanted to capture, to remember about this sighting, I had noticed that you don't see a hawk owl's feet. They perch in a tree, they grip the branch, but their feathers are so fluffy to survive the northern winters up in usually Canada and Alaska is where they winter. Their feathers fluff out and completely cover their feet. So that's the lower drawing here, is a detail to show that the feet are hidden. Now, 7 years later, I had just, I finished college. I went to college for almost a year and then left to go birdwatching full time. And this is right after I left college. A hawk owl was spending the winter in Portland, Maine, and I went up a couple of times to see that hawk owl. And this was some of the first drawings I did the first day of visiting that hawk owl. And I'm just, like I said, experimenting, testing out different lines, different shapes, the shapes of all the dark markings around the face. It's really a trial and error process of figuring out how to draw a bird. After a few more pages of sketches, a few hours of watching and drawing, I did this sketch. I went back a couple of days later and watched the same bird, and I spent a couple of hours working on this drawing, the extended interview. And I picked a straight profile pose so that I could kind of control the pose that I was looking for and wait for the bird to turn so it was sideways to me, but with its head looking directly at me. And I just worked on this drawing a lot. There's lots of erasing, lots of testing. And this drawing itself is not particularly, to me it looks kind of stiff and overworked, but I learned so much from this 2 hours of watching that hawk owl and trying to draw every detail of it. Later that day, I did this drawing, which is much more, now I have a real understanding of what a hawk owl looks like after that earlier practice. And I'm able to capture the essence of the hawk owl in fewer lines, but more accurately, understanding all the shapes. And then 7 years later, I'm sitting in the back of my friend's car in that photo I showed a couple of minutes ago. And this hawk owl was wintering in eastern Maine. We spent a couple of days with this bird, and this is one of the drawings that I worked on. There's another 7 years of nearly full-time watching and drawing birds leading up to this one. So there's a lot of general practice as well as experience with hawk owls. I admit it's not really fair to call this a field sketch. Most of my field sketches, I'll show you a couple in a minute, but they're very quick and rough. This is more of a finished pencil drawing, but hawk owls, unlike most birds, really lend themselves to finished pencil drawing because they tend to sit still for long periods of time. You can aim a telescope at them and work on a drawing and know that each time you look in the telescope, the hawk owl is almost sure to still be there. Going back another 7 years or so before that hawk owl, this is at Cape May, New Jersey. I was watching hawks, and these are 3 species of Buteos, the big soaring hawks. And I'm working on sketches just of the different shapes and proportions of these 3 species. And this one leaches storm petrels from the Blue Nose Ferry on the Gulf of Maine. And you can see all the experimentation here. Some are crossed out, some are unfinished. There's lots of extra lines where I started a wing shape and then changed it. But this is the process. This is the kind of thing that I did for years. And just there's another quote that I really like by an artist named John Muir Laws, who has a really excellent book on how to draw birds. And he says in that book, every sketch is just practice for the next one. All these sketches, I sort of thought that way intuitively. All these sketches none of them were meant to show anyone or to hang on the wall. They were just practice for the next sketch. So this is later, 7 years later, around the time of that hawk owl, the last hawk owl. This is a gray flycatcher in Arizona. This is costas and black-chinned hummingbirds in Arizona. And here I was traveling around the country, living in my camper van, and just watching birds and sketching full-time, and doing these kinds of detailed comparison sketches, working on ideas for a field guide. And around this time, 1989, when I really got serious about working on a field guide. I'd been serious about it, but I guess I started actually working on the idea. It was a few more years before I figured out exactly what I wanted to do and how I wanted to present the information, and started working on the paintings in 1993 that ended up in the field guide that was published in 2000. A long process, but exactly what I wanted to do. That whole time period, I guess when I started out birding here in Connecticut with the New Haven Bird Club, and my focus in birding was more on the sort of treasure hunt aspect of it, the wondering what's around the next corner, what species, what bird is going to show up. When are you going to see the first magnolia warbler of the spring or the first snow goose of the fall? And it was that excitement, not knowing what's next, that really excited me about birding. During those years when I was traveling around in my camper van, I had seen most of the species And my interest had shifted to the more academic details of all the minutiae of how to distinguish one species from another, males from females, adults from immatures, different subspecies. Once the field guide was published, and I revised it in 2014, but during that time, my interest in birds shifted to more about what birds are doing and why. Watching individual birds and wondering about their lives instead of just focusing on the identification. And I think it's one of the wonderful things about bird watching as a hobby, that there are so many different ways to approach it. And my approach has changed through my life, through my career. And that's what led to my most recent book, What It's Like to Be a Bird, was all these questions about what birds do and how they do it and why they do it. And as I worked on that book, off and on, 20-year project, show up at dinner after working on the book during the day, and my wife was joking that the first words out of my mouth would be, "You won't believe what I learned today." And there was so much information that even after 40 years of birding was new to me, and things that I thought I knew turned out to be wrong, and the truth was so much more interesting and fascinating. That's all what went into the book, What It's Like to Be a Bird, and I'll share a few of those things. Birds like this killdeer, it's a ground nesting bird, and they're famous for their broken wing act, which lures predators away from their nest. They pretend to have a broken wing, so a predator will chase them, and they move just fast enough to stay out of reach of the predator, but pathetically flopping along the ground. And then once they've lured the predator far enough away from their nest, they fly up and disappear, and then sneak back to their nest once the coast is clear. And they've got camouflage, the cryptic coloration, disruptive coloration that makes it difficult to see them. Their eggs are camouflaged, and they tend to lay their eggs ground that matches the color of the eggs, which is amazing that they have some instinctive understanding where they should put their eggs so that they'll blend in. But the thing that really amazed me learning about them is that they are camouflaged. That's all visual camouflage, but they're camouflaged by scent as well. During the breeding season, the oil that they preen into their feathers for feather conditioning changes to a chemical that is odorless, undetectable by mammals. A predator like a fox or a raccoon or something that's sniffing around at night will walk right by and not even detect them sitting on their nest. The researchers confirmed this by taking samples of the two different preen oils, the non-breeding typical preen oil and the breeding season preen oil, putting samples of it around a big warehouse and letting some hunting dogs roam around. And the dogs found all of the non-breeding season samples and walked by the breeding season samples. And apparently all ground nesting birds have this adaptation. Ducks and pheasants and other species that nest on the ground become odorless when they're sitting on their nest. One of the other themes in that book is all the things we don't know, and the obvious follow-up question for this is, if it makes them odorless and undetectable by predators, wouldn't it be wise to use that year-round? And they don't, but nobody knows why. Another thing I learned was, birds have an incredible sense of balance. You've all seen shorebirds or egrets or ibises standing on one leg, and sometimes even standing on one leg while they're on a twig, standing on a twig in a treetop that's swaying in the breeze, and they can still balance on one leg, and they can even be preening at the same time. So we have a balance sensor in our inner ear, and birds have that as well, a balance sensor in their inner ear. Try to balance on one leg. You can do it, but try making the motions of a bird preening, like turning your head around, swinging your head over your shoulder. It makes it much more difficult to balance. Birds have this balance sensor in their inner ear. They have a second one in their pelvis, so that even while they're swinging their head around preening, they can sense the movement, the balance of their body separately from their head. Another fun thing was why pigeons and other birds bob their heads when they walk, and it's all about vision. They snap their head forward to a position in space and freeze it there, and as they step forward, their body moves forward underneath their head. Eyes stay fixed in space, so they get an absolutely still, clear view of the world around them until they take the next step. Their head snaps forward to the next position, and then the body slides forward underneath it. They are bobbing their heads to keep as clear a view of their surroundings as they can, to keep their head perfectly still in space for these brief moments in time while their body moves forward steadily. And this one, there was another fun experiment the researchers did to confirm this. They put pigeons on a treadmill so that they walk, but their position in space doesn't change. They don't move through their surroundings. They stay in the same place. And their heads stayed perfectly still while they walked on the treadmill. Did not bob their head. This barn owl, owls have an incredible sense of hearing, and barn owl is among the most sensitive. Some research on barn owls found that when they were put in an experimental room where there was absolutely no light, complete and total darkness. If a mouse was released into the room, the barn owls would fly out from their perch and land precisely on the mouse, all of their talons, even in that total darkness. They would even orient, so their talons form an oval shape. They have 2 feet, and each, with the 4 toes on each foot, form a semicircle, and the 2 semicircles together form an oval. They would orient that oval of talons, to fit over the body of the mouse. So they had listened, and they knew what direction the mouse was going, presumably, and could make their attack oriented to the body of the mouse, even in total darkness. And it's still not really understood they do all that. It's easy to understand they can get the direction of the sound, and their ears are offset, so they get not just a horizontal direction like we do, but a vertical direction as well. So they can pinpoint the direction of the mouse, but knowing exactly how far away it is, one of the big questions about barn owls. How do they fly through the air in total darkness and drop onto the mouse exactly at the distance that it... One of the other interesting facts about this is that when the owls could see, if there was some light in the room, they would make a straight line approach to the mouse, just a direct line, and land on it. In total darkness, they would fly horizontally across the room to a position above the mouse and then drop down onto it. How do they first know the distance and then know exactly how far they've traveled through the air? So imagine you've all bumped your shins on furniture when you get up in the middle of the night and try to walk across the room in the dark. Imagine floating up out of your bed and floating through the air across the room to put your hand exactly on the doorknob on the other side of the room. That's what the barn owls are doing, and nobody knows how. This chimney swift is another example of a bird. Now, there's probably lots of chimney swifts around right now. They're gathering on their southward migration. Many of them have already gone south. But it's a bird that spends the whole summer in very populated places, in towns and cities across the eastern U.S. You would think we know everything about chimney swifts, but one of the things we don't know about chimney swifts is what they do all day in the summer. They nest in the chimneys, they come out of the chimneys in the morning, they fly around somewhere. How high, how far, no details about what they do all day. And it's pretty rare to see a chimney swift just out flying around in the summertime. The hypothesis that makes sense, since we don't see them much, is that they go up very high. And apparently there's a lot of baby spiders floating around up there at 15 or 20,000 feet up, eating baby spiders that are floating up on their little silks. And you would think a bird like a chimney swift that we all see every day in the summertime would at least know what they spend most of their time doing. Here's a little birds have been an inspiration for conservation for more than 100 years. And the egrets, like this snowy egret, the market hunting for feathers drove birds like this almost to extinction. The snowy egret was extremely rare in the late 1800s. And around 1900, the beginning of the Audubon societies, the Massachusetts Audubon was one of the first. People were concerned about birds and were concerned enough and valued birds enough to get laws passed to protect them and to discourage people from wearing feathers on their hats. Snowy egrets were saved, and at the same time, it was the beginning of national wildlife refuges, the beginning of a lot of bird conservation legislation that we still rely on today. Most of it was passed in the early 1900s. If it had come a little bit sooner, birds like the heath hen, this closely related to greater prairie chicken, but this heath hen was common in the Northeast from Boston to close to Washington, D.C., along the coast. But were mostly gone by the middle of the 1800s. They were easy to hunt, good to eat, and had a pretty limited range. They disappeared as the human population grew. Eastern meadowlark is a species that's disappearing from much of, especially the Northeast now. And a lot of bird conservation ultimately depends on habitat. And obviously birds need habitat as a place to live, but many species like eastern meadowlark need a very specific kind of habitat. 100 years ago, there were a lot of farms. This area would have been mostly farmland, hay fields and pastures and very few trees, and really good for eastern meadowlarks. Most of that farmland has turned into now housing developments and forest. Grassland, hay fields are pretty rare. The hay fields that still exist, that are still in operation, are now cut 3 or 4 times a year. There isn't enough time between cutting of hay for birds like bobolinks and eastern meadowlarks to raise young. So even in the habitat that's still suitable for them, decimated by the modern agricultural practices. So eastern meadowlark has probably virtually disappeared from Connecticut and Massachusetts as a breeding bird now. Doing okay farther west where there's still more farming, but it's a sort of a poster child for the changes in land use that have happened over the last 100 years. Bobwhite is a species that was fairly common here 100 years ago. And again, habitat probably has a lot to do with it, but bobwhite is declining across most of its range, even in Missouri, Mississippi, Georgia. And it's disturbing that nobody really knows why. There's a lot of theories, but there is no real understanding of why bobwhite is disappearing, even in places where habitat is managed for them. At the same time, species like Carolina wren, red-bellied woodpecker are doing extremely well. They thrive in the habitats that we have created in the suburbs. Climate change probably helps them a little bit. They're southern species that are moving north. Carolina wren is very common all across southern New England now. Red-bellied woodpecker as well. And red-bellied woodpecker in about 1972, I remember traveling from Guilford to Branford to visit someone's bird feeder to see a red-bellied woodpecker. That was one of the first records in Connecticut. Not that long ago for a species to colonize the entire state. Birds are incredibly adaptable. Many species, some species less so than others. Crows are very adaptable, and we tend to denigrate their adaptability. They make trouble for us by, for example, tearing up our garbage bags. But crows are incredibly adaptable. Most species are very adaptable, and it's part of it is because they are so intelligent. One of the things that I really took away from my work on what it's like to be a bird is how much birds are making decisions all the time. Automatons guided by instinct. They are actually value judgments every moment about what the best balance is of, whether there's good food over there, but is it safe to go there? Should I go later? Is there another place where I can get food that seems safer now? Is this a good place for a nest, or should I put it over there? All these decisions are going on. I used this illustration of a tufted titmouse in the book to demonstrate that you would think that a titmouse would just fly to a bird feeder and grab the biggest seed and carry that away. But they actually, if you watch titmice, chickadees, other species that carry food away from the feeder, they might pick up 3 or 5 or 10 seeds and drop them before they find the one they want and fly away with that. They're apparently judging the weight of the seed and maybe tasting it as well. And the weight gives them a sense of how much oil is in that seed, that oil tends to be dense and heavy, and oil has more calories. So a sunflower seed is heavier than other seeds of the same size because there's more oil in it. And so they'll pick up several seeds and then until they find the one that seems just right, and that's the one they carry away into the woods. Finally, this time of year, birds are on migration, migrating south. Most species that we know migrate. It's not typical of birds around the world. Most species are resident, but here at this latitude, most species migrate. And it's just an incredible thing that they do. This white-crowned sparrow launching into the air after sunset to fly several hundred miles potentially to land somewhere it doesn't know. And when it lands, it has to find habitat, it has to find shelter and water and food to replenish its energy, to take off again and do the same thing a couple nights later, avoiding predators along the way, avoiding accidents. A lot of it is, it's guided by instinct, it's instigated by instinct, but they are making decisions all along the way, and they remember places. Once they've made the migration once, they remember places. And this is where places like the Bristow Woods become so important as way stations for these birds that are migrating. They land in New Canaan, Connecticut at dawn, and they look around for a place that looks like it has enough undergrowth, enough cover, enough food, free of predators, free of disturbance, a little bit of water, and they gravitate to those places. And once they've done that one year, they might find their way back the following year. It becomes a way station that birds will use over and over. It's just one of the incredible things that birds do all the time, this migration season, and the things that makes them so exciting to watch. And places like the land that's set aside by the Land Trust here and the bird sanctuary, so important for all of their well-being. So thank you for all that you do for helping the birds along their way, and thank you for your interest.
Thank you so much, David. That was a really beautiful presentation. I think I can speak for everyone. We learned a lot today, and I think that we have some time for some questions. So if you raise your hand, I can come over to you. And yep, go ahead, right there.
Question is, what are your thoughts on putting out birdseed in the winter? Because I hear both sides. Yes, do it, and then I've heard several people say don't because they become dependent on it.
Yeah, this is a perennial question. It's sort of counterintuitive, but no, they do not become dependent on it. The few studies that have been done, there was a study in Wisconsin, I think, where some researchers took feeders in a state park that had been run continuously for something like 20 years. So the birds, like the chickadees, the residents there had generations of chickadees had grown up visiting these feeders. And they did an experiment taking those feeders down and removing that food source and seeing how well the chickadees survived. And there was essentially no difference in survival. And they found that the birds, even the chickadees that had lived there for years and used the feeders regularly, were only getting about 50% of their food from the feeders. It apparently helped them get through real crises like ice storms, but otherwise had essentially no impact on survival, and they did just fine without the feeders there at all. So there's no evidence that eating is bad for birds. There's some evidence that it helps them get through some really lean times. I think the best argument for bird feeding is just that it helps people interact with birds so much. It's so enjoyable for all of us. Connects us to the birds that way.
You have another question here.
How did you identify birds before there were the field guides?
I wasn't around before field guides, so I grew up with using mostly the Golden Guide, Birds of North America, illustrations by Arthur Singer. There's been a steady evolution of field guides. Roger Torrey Peterson created the modern field guide in the 1930s that revolutionized birdwatching, but he was presenting information that people around him knew and had developed. There was a group of people kind of led by Ludlow Griscom who had developed all the field identification skills and techniques, and Peterson was the illustrator who put it all into that book. And it has just continued to evolve and expand and be refined since then, and there's a lot more room for improvement and expansion, and field guides will continue to get better.
I have a question right here.
I have sort of three related questions. Did you have any formal art training? And can you draw other things besides birds? And do you ever use photographs?
Yeah, I don't have any formal training. By far the most important training for my art was the years that I spent just traveling, watching, and sketching, just pencil sketching. And most of that was just dealing with shapes, with outlines, like the sketches that I showed. because I think the outline of the bird is the most important part of the. If the outline is right, then all the color patterns just fit. It all works. If the outline is slightly wrong, then you can't make all the markings fit. It'll end up looking wrong. So I think just getting the training that I had, getting the sense of the shapes of birds and proportions. Drawing other things, yes, I do draw other things, and there's a general practicing drawing birds is just a way of seeing and a way of interpreting what I see. So I am able to draw other things, but not people. And photos, yes. Yeah, I use photos a lot. And more actually there, but I always go back to my field sketches again, just the experience and the understanding. If I ever try to just trace a photograph and use that exactly as the model for a drawing or a painting, it never looks right. There's some inexplicable thing that makes sense in the photograph and doesn't make sense when I turn it into a drawing. So I always end up just using the photographs to kind of refine my mental image of what the bird looks like and going back to my own memories and field experience. But yes, photographs are an absolutely essential reference material for all the work that I do.
What's your advice on the best ways to position and maintain bird boxes?
Oh, bird boxes. I don't know a whole lot about that. I've put up a few bird boxes and been moderately successful with it. But each species, different species have different preferences. I would say you'll find, like the Bluebird Society, have a lot of information about bluebirds and other species as well, but tree swallows want something different. And it really depends on the species that you're working to attract. More detailed references than what I could provide. Birds are quite particular about their boxes, and I think as a general rule, putting up more boxes is better.
Would you kindly explain how you charmed the owls and other subjects that you began to draw as a boy? How were you not misconceived as a predator?
Well, generally I'm watching from far away with a telescope or with binoculars. The owl, like the hawk owl, as I said, it's a great subject for drawing because they tend to sit still. And hawk owls will sit in the open, like on the highest branch of a tree or on a flagpole, and just sit there for an hour. Watch from a couple 100 feet away with a telescope and see all the details. Most of the other sketches that I do, I'm watching birds, and the birds are constantly moving, of course. So I'll pick a species to focus on, and I might walk around through the woods and find 10 different black and white warblers and watch each one and work on a page of sketches. But each of the sketches on that page might be a sort of a combination of multiple individual birds. I'll see little details on each one. And when I'm doing that, I'm relying a lot on my general knowledge of birds that I've developed over the years. So I can look at a black and white warbler and say, oh, I see the stripes on the head turn this way, and they're a little wider over the eye. And do a quick sketch that it's second nature to draw the shape of a warbler and then put that detail into it. So I don't have to see all the details on each individual bird. I can notice one little thing, like the shape of one marking, the shape of the wings, how they hold the wings and the tail, and do a quick sketch that includes that modification. But I have a kind of template in my head and in my hand, many different types of birds, so I can do a quick flycatcher with some modifications or a warbler with some modifications, and that's how I do the sketches of birds that I might only see for a few seconds. Get that on paper.
Did you ever try to get a bird as a friend?
I have never really tried. I had pet birds when I was a kid, and a couple of pet birds, and I enjoyed that, but it wasn't, it didn't feel quite right to me. I had other pets as well, and they were much more interactive and more fun, I don't know, something about keeping a bird as a pet, it just didn't sit right with me. So even though there were parakeets and cockatiels and things like that were bred in cages, it just didn't feel right. I had one funny experience at Cape May, New Jersey, where I spent a lot of time. You mentioned bird friends. A double-crested cormorant seemed to see me as a friend. I was just walking along the beach in the winter. There's no one else around, not many birds, and a cormorant flew by, and as it flew by, maybe 100 yards offshore, it suddenly made a 90-degree turn, flew right at me, landed on the sand about 15 feet away, and waddled across the sand right up to me. So it was standing 2 feet away from me and turning its head and looking up. Hello. And then it turned and ran a few steps and took off and flew away. I don't know what that cormorant was up to, but I think of that as my bird friend.
How many species of birds have you seen in person?
I don't keep close track of how many species I've seen. I haven't traveled. I've traveled quite a bit outside North America, but not as much as serious birders that I know. So the total number of species that I've seen around the world is probably something like 2,500. I've been to Africa a couple of times, and South America several times, and Central America and Asia once. So I've seen a kind of representation of birds all around. But I've never, when I was young, I kept very close tabs on my life list, and I knew exactly when I reached 600 species and 700 species, and then it got so rare to add I know what I've seen. I know which species would be new, but I haven't tried to count them up recently.
Okay, we have time for one final question here. I'm so sorry. I know we have so many more questions, but maybe you can ask a quick question when you're getting your book signed later. Who knows? So we're going to take one final question, and then we would like to present something to you at the end. Okay, here we are.
Hi there. So field guides are great when you can see the birds, but I always find that there's way more birds you can hear than you can see. Do you have any advice on learning how to identify birds by song, other than just hanging out and trying your best?
Yeah, well, that is basically it. That's always the advice that I would give over the decades. You have to I compare it to learning a second language. You really have to focus on it, and beginning is just listening to the sounds, really listening carefully and noticing up slur, down slur, 3 notes, 2 notes, many notes, noticing all these details of the sounds. And as you start to notice those details, you'll get better and better at hearing them and be able to distinguish more and more species, more and more subtle differences the more you listen. So that's the first part. And then just tracking down a bird. If you hear a bird and you're not sure what it is, just put in the work to find it. That's what I would have said a couple of years ago. But there's an app now called Merlin by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and many researchers and research projects contributed to it, and it's amazing how it identifies bird sounds. Very accurate, not 100% accurate, but very good, especially on the sounds that are clear and complex. Merlin app is the simple way to just hold up your phone and know that that's a tufted titmouse, that's a chickadee, that's a Baltimore oriole. If you want to actually develop proficiency to be able to do it yourself, just listening really carefully to the sounds, noticing the differences, watching the birds vocalize, tracking them down and watching them make the sounds is the way to really imprint it in your memory. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was wonderful to have your talk, and it really comes through how deeply you feel for your subject matter. As a small token of our appreciation, I'd like to present you this 1903 print. It is of a yellow-bellied sapsucker, whose name I particularly like,
Yes.
and also a black-billed cuckoo. And I thought, well, I don't have a Canaan Land Trust honey that you might enjoy. And then...
Thank you.
And I also think that you might want to wear this with the new Canaan Land Trust on it, and perhaps when you wear it, you'll make friends with a black-billed cuckoo. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And it's by one of my favorite artists, Louis Agassiz Fuertes, who was one of the great early 1900s.
I'm delighted. So just in closing, I would like you all to just take a moment and perhaps look underneath your seat. There are a special offer or a special opportunity for 2 people to go on a birding walk tomorrow morning with David. So do look. It's taped underneath your seat if you are lucky enough to get it. But there are also other gift items that are taped. And I do hope that you all take advantage of your $25 off coupon. Oh, you got one. There you go. And take a look for your $25 off coupon at Weed and Duria for bird seed and bird houses. Thank you all.